Fun Banter with the Penn State Extension Dairy Team. I'm Emily Fread, and I'm a dairy educator based in Union County, Pennsylvania. Joining us today is Dr. Heather Dann, president of the W.H. Minor Agricultural Research Institute in Chazy, New York. Today, we're going to be talking about transition cow nutrition. Heather, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. Thanks, Emily, for asking me to join you today on the podcast. Really, it's pretty simple. I'm just a farm kid who really liked to ask a lot of questions while growing up on a small dairy farm in New York State. My dad was a very patient man. I remember in particular a situation where we had a fresh cow that was down and she wouldn't get up. And I was amazed at and also concerned why my dad giving that cow an IV, how that worked. And it really led to me bombarding my father with a bunch of questions about milk fever. And there was also lots of other times that I think I asked a lot of questions, especially I was always intrigued. My dad would give a cow a glass Coke bottle of clear fluid. I learned really that that was propylene glycol and that was helping that cow get a little bit more energy that she could recover from ketosis. And so what I really found was that those early life experiences on the farm set the stage for me to attend school in animal science and then go on and pursue graduate work and research in the area of transition cow nutrition and management. And so now I feel really fortunate that I've spent most of my career as a scientist being able to ask questions, but now be able to answer them and help farmers in the community.
Great, thank you. How does a cow's nutritional needs change from the far off to the close-up period?
Yeah, this transition period is really critical. And it really starts off, I think, understanding the far off period, this time period when the cow is dried off until about 3 weeks before calving. And during this far off period, we really want to focus on maintaining the cow's health and preparing her for the upcoming lactation. And so during this time, cows really are fed a lower nutrient dense diet because they don't have a lot of requirements. But then as the cow enters the close-up period, a period of about 3 weeks before calving, her nutritional needs shift significantly. And we start feeding that cow a diet that becomes more nutrient dense to really support the rapid growth of the fetus that's occurring during that time period, as well as prepare the cow for the high demand of milk production that's going to happen after calving. Really, there's this balance that needs to happen as far as how we're going to feed cows from the far off to close up period. And some common feeding approaches are really during that far off period to keep the nutrient density low. We're going to control intake by feeding high forage diets and make sure the cows don't overeat. And this is very easy for cows to do during this far off period. And then once they get into the close-up period, we're going to reduce the amount of fiber in the diet and feed a little more digestible nutrients or carbohydrates, and also increase the amount of protein and minerals and vitamins that are in that diet to make sure that the animal is getting the right amount of nutrients. In particular, as she gets closer to calving, her dry matter intake is likely to decrease. That's just one of those natural physiological reactions that happen in the cow as calving approaches.
That makes sense. We know that milk production in the first few weeks after calving impacts a cow's peak production. What advice do you have regarding fresh cow diets and keeping that dry matter intake up to increase milk production?
That's a great question. For fresh cows, right, really the first couple of weeks after calving, dry matter intake can be a challenge because they're faced with metabolic and nutritional challenges as they go from a state of pregnancy or gestation to lactation. And we know that dry matter intake is going to allow them to be successful. And we can influence that dry matter intake by modifying the fresh diet. And that fresh diet's typically going to be based on a high group diet, just that it's formulated oftentimes to have a lower dry matter intake than that high group diet. So the fresh cow diet, really what we want to see is a nice balance of the carbohydrates that are in that. We want to make sure that we're providing the cow with plenty of fermentable carbohydrates in the forms of sugars and starches, but not too much fermentable carbohydrate that is going to lead to subacute ruminal acidosis, which we actually can see not only in our peak cows, but we can see that happening in our fresh cows when we have this balance off. We also want to make sure that we're providing the right amount of neutral detergent fiber so that the cow is eating to gut fill and is having proper rumen function and amount of rumination. But we need to be careful, especially as the cow gets into this second week of lactation, in not limiting dry matter intake because we've provided too much forage or forage NDF in the diet. And we actually see situations where dry matter intake can be limited in fresh cows because we've fed too much fiber. And if this is occurring on your farm, you're going to see cows that end up having ketosis after calving that aren't related to other health problems, and that type of ketosis will respond really well to moving that cow to a more fermentable carbohydrate diet like the high diet and allowing her to eat more energy. Now, it's not just energy that's going to impact the performance or intake of the cow, but we also need to make sure that we're balancing the diet for other key nutrients. And so protein in the form of metabolizable protein is important for these cows. And we're seeing very nice responses in animals to feeding additional protein as well as balancing the diet for rumen-protected amino acids. We also want to make sure that the fresh diet is palatable and consistent so that the cow will be willing to consume that feed. We also need to make sure that we're feeding frequently enough or having feed available for the cow. We want the fresh cow in particular to have several small, consistent meals throughout the day. We want to avoid the cow not having access to feed, and then when feed is available, slug feeding, and that's going to contribute to some rumen upset and potentially subacute ruminal acidosis. We also want to make sure that to optimize that cow having natural feeding behavior, that we have her in a housing situation that's comfortable with easy access to both feed and water.
Great, thank you. The average herd size in Pennsylvania is 94 cows, so farms are often smaller and have 10 or less dry cows at a time. Because of labor constraints, it's sometimes not feasible for farms to have a specific dry cow diet or a specific diet for far off and close up cows. So, do you have any advice for these farms?
That really is a challenge. And I think for small farms, having only a few dry cows at a time makes it difficult to justify separating the diets for the far off and close up cows, along with labor constraints further complicate the ability to manage these diets effectively. However, I do think there are some strategies that can be put in place to help streamline the feeding practices of these dry cows while still contributing to cow health and productivity. I think the first one that's probably the easiest to do on these smaller herds is to use a one group dry cow diet. And this diet could be implemented for 40 to maybe 55 days. And really, it's a very practical approach that meets the nutrient needs of both the far off and close up cows. It's a bit of a compromise, but it does simplify the feeding routines and reduce the need for multiple rations. But if you're going to use a one group diet, there are some things you need to keep in mind. I think the first is that the energy level, it's not going to be quite as low as what you would feed a far off cow, and it's probably going to be closer to the needs of the close-up animal. And so it's a moderate level. And so what we need to do is make sure that if we are going to use a one group dry cow diet, that we're going to ensure that the diet is not causing excessive weight gain. And we can use body condition scoring or weighing the cows as a way to kind of track that. The concern here is that if the animals are gaining too much weight, that it's going to increase the risk of metabolic issues like ketosis after calving. We also want to make sure this one group diet has adequate fiber. Fiber is going to help control intake, make sure the cows don't overeat, and so it will help maintain rumen health and prevent some digestive issues as she goes into calving. We're also going to balance the minerals and vitamins for this diet, and we're going to do it more closely to a traditional close-up diet than a far-off diet. I think one of the interesting things that could happen with these smaller farms is there's maybe a collaborative solution in that small farms might benefit from working together. Neighboring farms might be able to share resources like mixing the close-up or far-off diets or a one-group diet and be able to implement those on farm easier than either farm doing it themselves. And so this might also be an option to help manage cost or improve the overall feeding program. And I think also there's a role for extension services like you play, Emily, with utilizing your services for advice and support to help identify specific solutions for their farms.
I think that's a great idea, Heather. A lot of these farms are often on the same lane or within a mile of each other, so it would probably be feasible to share a mixer, mix diets together. I think that's a great idea. Can you explain a DCAD diet and its pros and cons?
Sure. Basically, there are two primary ways that farmers and their nutritionists are controlling hypocalcemia or really low blood calcium after calving and the occurrence of milk fever on farm. And they're doing that by using either a mineral binder or using a DCAD strategy. And the DCAD or dietary cation anion difference, it's really just the measure of balance between positively charged ions called cations, like sodium and potassium, and negatively charged anions like chloride and sulfur in the cow's diet. And the goal of a DCAD diet is really to manipulate this balance to improve the health and productivity of the cow, in particular as the cow is going from the dry period into the lactating period. And so when we formulate these close-up diets primarily, or it can be done in a one group diet, oftentimes with DCAD, we're targeting a negative value that ranges from somewhere for a fully acidified diet of minus 100 to minus 150 milliequivalents per kilogram of dry matter. So when we have this negative DCAD diet, we have more anions and cations, and then this is used during that close-up period to induce a mild metabolic acidosis. And this acidosis helps the cow mobilize calcium from her bones more effectively and reduces the risk of milk fever and other calcium-related problems at calving. And so to make sure that we have the right amount of metabolic acidosis occurring, we can use urine pH to help us tell how acidified the cow is. And so you want to select a few animals within your pen or your group that you're feeding. And we ideally want to see the urine pH somewhere in the 6 to 7 range. A cow, if you were to take a lactating cow and collect her urine, it's usually going to be around 8 to 8.5. And so this DCAD diet is causing that urine to decrease in value. And actually, with certain types of products, the target urine pH might even be a little bit lower. And we've seen several different examples of where having the urine pH in the range of 5.5 to 6.5 works extremely well on farms. There are a number of advantages for using a negative DCAD diet. The first one is really that it reduces the occurrence of milk fever. The second one is that it improves the overall health of the animal. So cows on a negative DCAD diet often experience fewer cases of subclinical hypocalcemia or low blood calcium. They have less retained placentas and metritis. And in general, it leads to overall healthier cows. And since the cows are healthier with better calcium status, they're likely to produce more milk. And that's always a win for us. Like any program or any approach, there's always going to be some challenges. And so with having a negative DCAD program, one of the challenges is that it can be complex to manage and implement well. One is that you need to be consistently tracking or monitoring urine pH. And so it's important to do that at least weekly on most farms. There is an associated cost with using anionic salts, and so we need to make sure that those are being used effectively. And we want to make sure that the diet isn't being over acidified, because if that happens, then there's a likelihood that dry matter intake will decrease more than expected as calving approaches. Now, there are some tips that we need to implement on farm to make sure strategy is implemented well, and this would be accounting for the minerals that are actually in the forages. And a lot of our forage analysis happens with near-infrared spectroscopy. But really, when we're trying to fine-tune dry cow diets, we should be using wet chemistry or the reference method for those macro minerals. We also need to make sure that the diet is being mixed well and making sure that the cow isn't sorting the diet. Otherwise, you'll have very variable urine pHs identified within your group of animals. When you are selecting sources of anionic salts, it seems that most of the commercial products are a better option than using things like calcium chloride or ammonia chloride because those non-commercial sources are going to affect palatability and the cow's intake isn't going to be quite as great.
Do bred heifers and cows have different nutrient needs when it comes to the transition period?
Bred heifers and cows definitely have different nutritional needs. We know that bred heifers or the first calf heifers are still growing themselves while they're preparing to give birth and start lactation. This dual demand means that they have unique nutritional requirements. Typically, if we were feeding heifers and mature cows separately, we would want to feed those heifers a diet that's higher in energy, higher in protein, because that protein is going to be needed for muscle development. And we're also going to provide additional minerals and vitamins for those animals. And so one of the challenge comes that many of our farm size don't allow us to feed separate diets because of facility constraints. And so we end up feeding basically a diet that is kind of a compromise during this close-up period. And so oftentimes we're going to maybe feed a little higher protein and a little more energy than what we might to our mature cows if we were just feeding them separately. And so this seems to be a good compromise in that as long as we watch condition and metabolic health of the mature animals, that this slight overfeeding for them should not be a negative, but also should provide some additional energy and protein and other nutrients for the heifer.
Great, thank you. Many dry cows in Pennsylvania are pastured during the summer. What are some things that farmers need to keep in mind when their dry cows are out on pasture?
I think pasturing dry cows during the summer can be a great way to reduce feed cost and provide cows with a natural environment. However, there are several key factors that farmers need to keep in mind to ensure the health and productivity of the herd. I think one of the first ones, Emily, you're well familiar with this one, is heat stress. So managing heat stress in dry cows can be a major concern during the summer. Cows are particularly vulnerable to high temperatures, which can affect their health and future milk production. And so there's some things that we want to do out on pasture to mitigate some of that heat stress. Make sure the cows have access to plenty of shade and fresh, clean water, and this is going to help them stay cool and hydrated. Some farms, maybe not so much in New York or parts of Pennsylvania, but as we go more south, some farms have been successful installing cooling systems right out on pasture. Another area that we need to keep in mind is fly control. Flies can be a nuisance and health hazard for these pastured cows. And more importantly, probably effective fly control is essential to prevent issues like mastitis. We know that cows at dry off as well as at calving are most susceptible to the risk of mastitis. And so it's important that we have these animals out on pasture. We're controlling the flies, but we're also avoiding high risk areas near wet, swampy areas or places that flies are likely to congregate. We also have the challenge of pasture management. So we need to make sure that the pasture is properly used. If it's just being used as a dry lot and exercise, that's one thing. But if it's being used as a source of nutrients for the animal, meaning the animals are grazing that, we need to make sure that the pasture remains sustainable or the animals are being rotated at the appropriate times to allow pastures to recover and avoid overgrazing. And we need to make sure that the cows are getting the right nutrient intake. So pasture management really is important to make sure that the forage quality is appropriate for this stage of the cow's lactation cycle. We need to monitor that forage quality and potentially even at times have to supplement the pasture with some stored hay or silage so that the nutrient needs of the animal are being met. I think one of the challenges that can also come with having animals out on pasture is where are they actually calving? And at times, if the animal is able to exhibit her natural behavior, she's going to isolate or seclude herself from the herd. And so this can make finding the calf after it's born quite difficult at times. And that's a lesson I definitely learned as a young kid growing up on the farm.
Great, thanks, Heather. I do appreciate you bringing up heat stress since that's what I did my master's work in. If anyone's interested in learning more about heat stress, we did do a bovine banter season about heat stress over the summer. So feel free to go back and listen to those episodes. So, Heather, You've been doing transition cow research your whole career. You research a lot of other things as well, but what research do you hope to pursue in the future regarding transition cow nutrition?
So looking ahead, I think there's a number of exciting and essential research areas that are needed to continue to improve the management of our transition cows. I think one of the key areas for sure is precision nutrition. So this involves tailoring diets to the specific needs of the individual cows based on their health status, production levels, as well as their genetic makeup. And so with using advanced technologies like sensors and data analytics, I think we're going to be able to develop more precise feeding strategies that can optimize the health and milk production of the cows. Also, I think focusing on immune function and health monitoring is another critical area. We know that there's a lot of work being done to understand the immune function, and that's not surprising given that the transition period really is a time of increased vulnerability to disease or metabolic issues, in part due to this suppressed or altered immune system. And so I think the research that we're looking at doing is focusing on identifying biomarkers that can predict health issues before they arise and allow us for opportunities to intervene. We're also looking at different nutritional interventions or products that can be fed during the early dry period or late dry period to help boost the immune system and making that cow more successful as she transitions into lactation. And I think in general, we're looking at ways overall to continue to reduce metabolic disorders such as hypocalcemia, ketosis, subacute ruminal acidosis. The industry has made a great strides in reducing the amount of clinical health problems that are occurring, but now we're really focused on some of the subclinical issues that we know may be limiting some of our transition success. And as we're implementing better nutritional strategies and management strategies, we know that we probably can continue to make strides here.
Do you have any take-home messages for our audience?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things to achieving transition success on any farm is to really focus on management and nutrition during both the dry and fresh periods. And it really comes down to me when I think about it as removing or reducing stressors. And these stressors can be from the environment, they can be social stressors, things such as stocking density or how animals interact with one another, or even how we interact with those animals, as well as nutritional stressors and making sure that we get the diet formulated properly so that we're providing the right amount of nutrients at the right time. And for me, why I'm focused so much on stressors is that we know that stressors divert nutrients away from productive functions. And our goal really is to have a healthy, productive cow that's producing large quantities of milk with good components and be able to reproduce at the right time. And so for me, I think about these stressors as children's building blocks. And one of the things that I want to do as a kid was to build the tower as high as possible. But now, as I think about achieving transition success, I want to keep that block tower as low as possible. And so we need to all look for opportunities on the farm to be able to reduce those stressors.
That's a great answer. Thank you, Heather, for talking with us today. And thank you to all of our listeners. If you have any questions about this topic, please email me at evf5337@psu.edu. Don't forget to tune in next Tuesday when Casey Hauer will discuss using records during the transition period with Michael Lunak.